Hey everybody, welcome back. Welcome if you're new here. This is going to be a sort of part 2 of my August reads, all the rest of the books I read this August, 2 of which I was reading before the month even started, and they took me the whole month to finish. Those are the 2 shortest actually, which is pretty funny. And then another novel I've read in like the last 4 or 5 days, which started off really good and then sort of went a little downhill. And then a story collection I'm really loving. But yeah, let's get to these 3 novels first, which were all not as good as I was expecting, but I had strong reactions to all of them at different points, and that always makes me excited to talk about them. So let's start with Service, because this one's the sort of freshest in my mind. I just finished it this morning. I sort of skimmed the end. It's unfortunate because this book, so Service by Jon Tottenham, this came out I think pretty recently. I'd heard a bit of chatter about it. He's a poet, has had some books of poetry out. This is his first novel. There was Rachel Kushner and Colm Toybeen blurbs, and it was just getting a lot of attention, and I was like, let me check this out. Another big thing I should say is I've been trying to find books that will maybe connect in some way to the novel I'm writing, which, if you've watched some of my other videos, has a lot to do with sort of the service art world, whether it's like bookstores or galleries or things like that. And this takes place in a bookstore. So the main character, Sean, is a 40-year-old bookstore employee who has just quit writing. He has, his entire life wanted to write a novel. He's written various 10,000 words, 20,000 words, but he's never gotten all the way there. And he's actually in his late 40s, not 40. Because he's almost 50, he talks about that a bit. And he sort of decides he doesn't have it in him. He's a very resentful person, as you might imagine, and he sort of takes out his anger on the people at the bookstore he works in. You get the feeling that some characters are being left out and some moments in his life are being left out, which is sort of interesting and intriguing and keeps you moving forward. But the really funny parts are the dialogues between him and the customers. And I think that is what made me the most interested. It's a pretty fragmented book. I don't know if I can find some examples, but there's a couple of pages where there's like 5 breaks in the text. I don't know, it's not broken up into chapters, if you get what I mean, and so there's a lot of smaller sections. But all the sort of longer sections take place in a bookstore, and those are all very funny. I'm actually going to read the very beginning dialogue, because that was what I remember. I read this while I was at the bookstore looking at this book, and I was like, this is incredible. "Do you need a bag?" I asked, and received no response. "Do you need a bag?" I asked again, and again received no response. I tried again, a 3rd time. This time the customer looked up from his texting. "What?" he said. "A bag," I said. "Do you need one?" "What kind of bag?" asked the customer, a clean-cut young man with facial hair and neck tattoos. "Do I have to describe the bag?" I said. "Is it a paper bag?" he asked. "Yes, it's a paper bag," I said, and handed him the brown paper bag. He walked off, looking put out. Perhaps he had wanted me to bag the book for him. "Hi, Sean." From whom this greeting came, I had no idea. It is the fate of the terminal bookstore employee to frequently be addressed by people he doesn't know. A forlorn figure shuffled up to the counter with an expectant look on his face that suggested I should be pleased to see him. I returned an unconvincing imitation of his smile, anticipating the 20 minutes of my time that this energy-draining vampire was certain to consume. It was inconceivable that he would leave any sooner than that. He was fresh and ready to twist my ear off. This might be his first social interaction of the day, but it was my umpteenth, and I was trapped. "What's going on?" he asked. "Nothing." "What else is going on?" "You mean apart from nothing?" He just stood there, waiting for me to alleviate his boredom. Not content with killing his own time, he wanted to kill mine too. So that kind of hooked me, and there's a ton of other conversations just like that. And I think the mix of how funny he is in his exchanges back and forth with not just customers but his boss. Every time he sees his boss has another 3 or 4 Yelp reviews that people have left with some funny complaint about Sean. And sometimes we have seen the interactions and we can recall them, or sometimes we don't, like at the beginning. And then there's sort of that mixed in with the way he looks at living in LA, how gentrified his neighborhood has become. Remembering the sorts of shops and the affordable groceries he used to be able to get and the kinds of people he used to see versus sort of the wealthy young couples that have moved in recently, and the whole change in both his life and the lives of others. And there's a really interesting understanding of that, and I love the parts where he's kind of ruminating on that, specifically angry about the way that LA itself has changed in the past, 20 years that he's lived there. And so that whole sort of first section, this book's divided up into 3 parts, was kind of like that. And there's mention of him getting back into writing and trying to kind of get his flow back, but you don't see a ton of that. And I think that's where it's most interesting, where he's decided to quit writing and evaluating his life for what it is. But then slowly it turns into this like meta fiction novel where the writer is drawing very clear attention to the text as text, which of course brings you out of it. And this is an interesting method. For me personally, I am interested in reading like Jon Barth and being like, wow, this is somebody who's doing something really inventive, and oftentimes he does it in a way that it just seems to translate better than the hundreds and maybe thousands of writers who have begun to do that after him. What I will say is that the fact that he's writing this book calls attention to that in like is transcribing conversations he's having about writing this book, getting advice on the book. The advice is calling out things that are wrong with the book, maybe like it's repetitive or there's no female characters or all these things that he sort of, it's almost like the author wants to show that he's self-aware of what's wrong with this book. But, the character couldn't write a better book, so I don't have to write a better book. And this is where it just becomes kind of ridiculous. And it's not just you're not just showing that you're self-aware, you're showing that you're self-aware that you're self-aware. Because you kind of mentioned, somebody's like, you're too self-aware of the fact that this book is bad or whatever. And then he's like, yeah, I know that. And so it just sort of becomes this infinite loop of self-awareness. And it just totally ruins the story for me. And I think turned possibly a really great text by a pretty talented writer into something that became more of a puzzle or maze, but one that wasn't that interesting, and the writing became almost more like pretentious and purpley, and it just kind of spiraled. Part 2, I kind of hung in there, and I was like, there were good parts and bad parts, and then towards the end it was like, all right, I kind of know where this is going, and I did, and it just, I don't know, I just didn't think there was enough to make this a good novel. It was written well, and I enjoyed parts of it for sure. Spent a lot of time laughing out loud. I don't often get that from books, even when they are funny. But it just wasn't one I was entirely happy with. And on that point, another book I just finished is The Days of Abandonment by Elena Ferrante. And this was exactly the same thing. First of all 3 of these are first-person narrators. And honestly, I don't mind a first-person narrator. Like I've talked about Frank O'Connor being one of my favorite writers, and his sort of first-person narrators, especially when they're children, are stellar, amazing. I'm not sure what the difference is. I've been thinking a lot about it. I think it has something to do with the directness, the sort of using the first-person narrator to convey something to the reader that the character might not understand. But I also think the thing about O'Connor is that he uses sort of direct language, like really, really strong language, but direct. And especially when it's in first person, I think that works really well. I think something like Service or The Days of Abandonment can get kind of out of control. I don't know if it's the translation or what it is. I have heard from people that loved the Neapolitan Quartet that The Days of Abandonment is not nearly as good, but it was shorter. I thought I'd pick it up before I read My Brilliant Friend, which I'm still going to read because I've still heard really great things. But this one of her earlier novels, it seems like she's kind of finding her voice in a way. And I think that this could have benefited a lot from comedy because it's about, and I've talked about this in my Philly vlog, so I won't get too deep into it, but it's just a woman whose husband leaves her and she sort of falls apart. There is actually some self-awareness drawn onto the character when she sort of talks about how much she dislikes this particular book that she was given as a child where, this woman went mad after her husband left her, and then this turns into that. So that's a little bit funny, and it's only there once, and I don't really care or mind that much. But I think the way that this novel went, which is like wherever this woman goes, something bad is going to happen. And whether it's involving her kids or her dog or, her house, or she's going to, she's going to mess everything up. She's going to let the dog off the leash. The dog is going to get hurt. Everything that can go wrong will go wrong. She's in a distraught state, and there's no real redemption from it. And you kind of grow to not like her because even though her husband isn't there for her or her kids, she has put her kids in a really tough spot. where like they have to take care of her. And honestly, I feel like it doesn't give enough credit to the protagonist. I think if you're going to take this sort of plot seriously, you have to have this character realize how awful of a relationship she was in. And she does in spurts, but at the same time, she's losing her mind. And I just think that it's both unrealistic, or if you want to make it realistic, I just think that the sort of writing style, which can come off as pretentious at times, mixed with the lack of humor in these situations that actually are very humor-filled, and the sort of way she treats the protagonist, the mother, who's in a tough spot, kind of put me off of the book. And it also, like, the story didn't really go anywhere. It just wasn't for me. Again, I am still very excited to read My Brilliant Friend. I just think that whether it was the timing, reading all of these books so close together, or whatever else it may be, this was one that I was not the biggest fan of. So yeah. And then this last book, Boathouse by Jon Fosse. I've read some newer Jon Fosse. I've read the short story, The New Yorker. That's going to be a part of his trilogy that comes out in September, the newest one. And I'm probably going to read Septology at some point because that just seems super intriguing. This is another case of going back to read the writer's early work. And this was actually quite good. I think it's about very little, but a lot of his stuff is about very little. And the sort of main character who's been stuck in his hometown for, say, 20 years, right? His boyhood friend comes back with his wife. He's a successful teacher now and all these things. And so you kind of get the juxtaposition between those two characters. But then there's this sort of interest between our main character and his friend's wife. And he strikes you as pretty unreliable, not just because of how the book starts, which is an incredible line. I don't go out anymore. A restlessness has come over me and I don't go out. And he kind of goes on, as one does in a Fosse novel, to repeat himself 100 times. And I think that the thing that I like about Fosse is how sort of close he gets to consciousness and how we actually think. Because I think we do sort of, if you think about like our actual thoughts, they're not direct like they are in a book. They oftentimes repeat themselves, they swirl around, they get mixed up, and he does that sort of thing. The sort of same points will come back, insert themselves in the middle of a new thought. But to spend, I don't know, 150 pages on something that, nothing's really changing, the story isn't going anywhere. You get maybe an interesting segment where you realize that the man who's come back to town, like, danced with his friend, with a girl his friend liked once when they were kids, and just sort of that. But it just didn't feel like there was enough here for a book. And I don't know, I tend to find that this happens sometimes with shorter books. I mean, this is like 180, this is like 150, and then I'll read a 300 page book or whatever in a much quicker time and enjoy it quite a bit more. It feels much more fully formed. And it's not that I need the length. I've read plenty of novellas that I like. I think novellas are like the most perfect thing in the world, a good novella. It's like the perfect length. But I also obviously love short stories, so I don't know what it is. But yeah, I didn't hate any of these books. This one kind of made me lose my mind a bit towards the end. These two I was just a little dissatisfied with, and that happens. You know, a lot of the past couple videos have all been like books I love, because I've had these sort of on the back burner to talk about, and I didn't really want to, but I'm glad I did, because I did have some thoughts on them. And then just to end on a happy note, I've been reading Karate Chop by Dorthe Norse, the Danish writer, a collection of short stories. And then I picked up this from the library here at UW, which is just new Irish short stories. There's like Kevin Barry, Sally Rooney, all these people. But I picked it up because Wendy Erskine is in here. And I've been reading a lot of Colin Barrett lately. I don't know where that... Oh yeah, Young Skins is the collection I've really enjoyed. And he sort of recommended Wendy Erskine's novel. And so I was kind of interested in that, and then I looked her up, and she has an insanely interesting story. And I decided I'd check this out. I really like the story. The story in here was called Mikey Mulholland. Yeah, it was a great story. It sort of subverts the reader's expectations in so many ways. I don't know what collection it's in. I just ordered a full collection of hers because I really want to read her stuff. But she's so compact in her writing. I read that, you know, she writes 20,000 word drafts and then brings that down to 6,000 for the final, which is just unfathomable to me. in terms of how I write. But you can tell, like, the directions that she shifts in and out of are so shocking and can only come from writing in so many different directions and then sort of choosing what makes the least sense, but at the end of it actually make the most sense. I don't really know how to describe it, but that's a really wonderful story. And I should say that Dorthe Norse does that as well, but sort of to the extreme. I'm going to read from The Buddhist, which was my favorite story in this collection. I'm actually not done with it. I have a few left. But a lot of her stuff is like 3 or 4 pages, and it'll start somewhere. Like this first story starts with a girl who presumably is like a high school girl. Her boyfriend's just been over. She's kind of sitting there and kind of a little bit dazed from them hooking up. And the way that it goes, like if you look, this is literally 3 pages. And if you look at where it ends, I mean, I don't even know how that connects. But then you read the whole thing. It's just like, I don't, this is like one of the first like truly unique short story collections I've read in a while, because it writes so directly and is rooted in realism, but at the same time is somehow experimental, and not even in form or not even in structure really, but at the same time, yes, in structure. I don't know. I mean, her stuff is really, really interesting, and she has some stuff published online, so I'd recommend checking out literally any of her short stories. I've never read a novel of hers. I know she has some novels, but she's most well known for her short stories. Let me see if I can find a little segment of this story, The Buddhist, which is basically about a man on a downhill spiral. He is it's almost like if the Days of Abandonment was handled in a funny way, because this guy basically convinces himself that he should be a Buddhist and is simultaneously as bad of a person as he used to be, but tricking himself along the way, so it's okay. And he basically, the story ends, I'm just going to give it away because it's such a crazy ending. It ends with him in his office with the door locked, lighting the place on fire. I mean, so take that as you will. It's a bit of a longer story, and I'm sorry to have spoiled it, but I had to tell you. I think it's fascinating to think about in context with this beginning. And also, it's not going to ruin it at all, because the magic of her stories is really the middle and how she moves from one place to the other. Before the Buddhist became president of the aid organization People to People, he was an ordinary Christian and a government official in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was the one who wrote the foreign minister's speeches and thereby put words into the foreign minister's mouth. It was a way of lying, and at first it didn't bother him any. Then it started bugging him because he realized he was a Buddhist. It didn't come to him all of a sudden that he was a Buddhist. It was more like the Buddhist, as an idea, crept up and settled in him shortly after his wife said she wanted a divorce. The Buddhist came in and sat down at the opposite side of his desk in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He contemplated the Buddhist and thought it was a good format to step into. Buddhists are good people. They're deeper than most. Buddhists can see connections no one else can. These were all qualities he recognized in himself, but which all could be improved upon, and so he became a Buddhist. If he hadn't become a Buddhist, the divorce would have hurt that much more. But a Buddhist gains insight through pain. The more it hurts, the wiser the Buddhist becomes, the government official thought. And he stopped being a Lutheran. Which is exactly it. Like, oh, well, this is how I would think about it, or this is what I would do, but I'm a Buddhist, so this is what I'm going to do. And of course, he doesn't actually do those things, but he does sort of think about that, and he doesn't address all these. I mean, it's a totally fascinating story. I really enjoyed that one. I will probably try and write a more detailed review of this on Goodreads, but that's all I have to say for the moment. This is from Grey Wolf, as always, one of my favorite presses, somehow publishing all my favorite writers. And Norse is just fascinating. I mean, something that I love about sort of Norwegian writing, and this applies to like Knausgaard or a number of other people, is they get to focus on sort of human questions because they're in sort of a socially secure environment. And so things like money and, maternity leave or healthcare or food or rent, they all sort of, they function very differently. And I think it's interesting because they function differently. And so you could say, oh, well, how about like a rich person in the US, right? So but I've been thinking about that too, and sort of the difference between a Frank O'Connor and a Samuel Beckett. And I think that somebody who is living in a place where that sort of removal from those things doesn't exist. But because you're rich, you're living that, you're just sort of out of touch is all that is. And I think that shows up in the writing sometimes. And I think it leads people down these weird rabbit holes of experimentation. Not that I'm for or against any sort of style of writing, but I think that it sort of becomes too much at a certain point. And I think that it doesn't necessarily exist, because you can have somebody whose like entire occupation is like a gig musician in a Dorthe North story, and you know, the chief concern, if that was written in America, would just be, how the heck am I going to afford an apartment in the city? You know what I mean? So it's like, it's just a totally different way of thinking and looking about things. I love her writing. That's just a dynamic I'm really interested in. But yeah, I guess that's all I have to say on these books. If I was going to recommend any of them, I would recommend this one. I know I've been talking more about short stories than I probably should be, but I have so many novels that I'm going to be reading for class, which I'll break down soon. I've got some other ones on deck. I just started the Brandon Taylor novel that comes out very soon, and I will have some more short stories to talk about, but also some really interesting novels I'm getting into. And thank you guys for watching. I hope this was an enjoyable video. I wanted to keep it short and sweet and say thank you for all the support. It has now been, I think, like a year and a half of making videos almost. So a huge thank you to everybody who's watched and commented and reached out and shared and all those things, because it really has, I think, held me accountable to my reading goals, to writing, to, I don't know, sort of all these things, and has really sort of shifted my life in a good way. And I'm just really thankful for that. There will be more videos on the way soon. And as always, have a great rest of your day. Have a great week. And I'll check in a few days. Peace.